And he's a professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering there at Cornell. And we're actually, it's just a delight to have Stefano not just on the same continent as us, but on the same East Coast. For discussants, we've invited Che Soterat, who is a young eco-ambassador who works on fish migration and water quality in the Mekong River basin, and she supports youth and climate action as a young eco-ambassador. We've also invited Piatida Rungrasamy, who is an assistant professor with the Department of Water Resources Engineering at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. And Sotirat and Piatida will be joining us towards the end of our discussion to engage with Stefano and challenge him a bit on ways to further improve his research and also to gain more understanding about what the data tells us. This event is on the record, so you're welcome to ask questions that are on the record, as well as use what you hear during our event today and see for your own various purposes. And if you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box within the Zoom portal down below and the options down below. And we will get to them and ask them later on during our session. So Stefano, without any further ado, over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the wonderful presentation. Let me begin by sharing my screen. There we go. Can you all see my screen? Okay. Perfect. Okay, so as Ryan mentioned, I'm going to give you a short overview of some of the work we began in Singapore about 4 or 5 years ago with my team. We're still carrying out the work both in Singapore and now at Cornell University. Now, before continuing, let me acknowledge Dung was a former PhD student with me in Singapore. Tan Dang was a former postdoctoral fellow with me in Singapore, and Shanti is based in Singapore and is still working on some of the things I'm going to show you today. So one question you might have is, why models? Well, if for those of you that are not, let's say, specialized in hydrological modeling, we like to have models, we like to work with models because essentially it can help us answer what-if questions. Monitoring dams is particularly useful, of course, if we're able to complement the information, the data that we can infer, the information that we can learn from images or from other types of remote science data, and bring them into hydrological models. We can ask a broader set of questions. For example, how would the river flow change should we operate a given dam in a different way, for example? But I'm going to show you some examples later. Now, the question is, why is large-scale hydrological modeling challenging? Well, I'm focusing here on Southeast Asia. So what you see here on the right-hand side are the largest basins in Southeast Asia. And the challenges I'm going to mention are, in fact, challenges that we face pretty much everywhere else. So what are some of these challenges? Meteorological forcings. We need to have good information about, for example, precipitation. We do monitor precipitation. We've been monitoring precipitation for decades, pretty much everywhere. We can complement that with information from satellite observations for rainfall, but there is sometimes a little bit of uncertainty there between different meteorological products, for example. To calibrate, validate, make sure that our hydrological models work properly, we need good information about river discharge. This perhaps is obvious, but having good information about river discharge everywhere is still a challenge. We don't have good observations at all points that we would like to have. And third, human actions. Hydrological models, at least historically, as often, if not always, been developed to validate our understanding of the hydrological cycle. So they do not necessarily account for human actions. And the science of catchment hydrology and global scale, large scale hydrology is changing, is evolving to account for how human actions affect the hydrological cycle. So accounting for that explicitly within an hydrological model is not necessarily straightforward. And when I talk about human actions, I'm referring to flow regulation and diversion through dams, for example, land use change, which happens at a slower pace, or irrigation, which, of course, again, changes the how water is distributed across space and time. And today, of course, I'm going to focus on flow regulation and diversion. Is particularly challenging. Of course, if you look at Southeast Asia, what you see here now in the map are the largest dams. It's about 200, 250 dams roughly across all basins. The size of each circle corresponds to the size of each dam in million cubic meters. But perhaps what is even more interesting is the color. So the red essentially corresponds to dams that have been built recently. And as we know, a very large number of dams has been built during the past 10, 20 years in Southeast Asia. That has changed hydrological processes significantly. So accounting for that in an hydrological model is necessarily not straightforward. So what do we need? We need two things. We need to be able to infer storage time series. So going back to a key point that Brian mentioned earlier. And then we need to find ways to include that information within hydrological models. So in the remaining 15 minutes or so, I'm going to speak about these two different points. Number one, how do we infer storage time series? And number two, how do we include that information within hydrological models? So let me begin by telling you a little bit about the first part. Now, let me just take one step back and go very quickly through some of the satellite observations and data that we can work with. So we have digital elevation models, so models essentially of the terrain that we can use to study the topography of a catchment, the bathymetry of a given valley before, for example, a dam was built. There are many different products available. Just one example is the SRTM digital elevation model, which was created back in 2000. What you have here on the bottom is an example for one specific dam, which is Xiaowan Reservoir before the reservoir itself was built. So you can see the steep valleys here where the dam has now been created. We have imagery, which we can use typically, for example, to study how land use has been changing or to study the water surface extent of water bodies, rivers, lakes, reservoirs, etc. Well, perhaps the chief example is Landsat, is still an ongoing mission that has been running through different stages since 1972. So it's great, of course, because it can help us go back in time and study how, for example, land use or water surface area has been changing over decades. With MODIS, for example, pardon me. With MODIS, what you see here is, again, for Xiaowan Reservoir, an example of a tile of a Landsat image. So what you can see perhaps here in blue is the reservoir that has been built. Another example is Sentinel from the European Space Agency. But we can also work as altimetry, as again, Brian was mentioning. With altimetry, we can monitor directly the water level of a reservoir, the water level of a river. Sentinel, or another example is JSON. So what you see again here on the bottom again is again an example for Xiaowan Reservoir. You can see the satellite following this line, and here on the right hand side the altimetry from the JSON satellite of the Xiaowan Reservoir. So all of this is great. The larger the amount of data we can work with, the better it is, of course. And to this, I should actually add that the SWOT mission was launched in December 2022. So it has started to produce the first water level and water surface observations that's specifically dedicated to hydrologists and oceanographers. I guess everybody is looking forward to work with those data. So the question is now, each of these data sets and pros and cons, and as hydrologists, as scientists more broadly, we need to understand, I believe, which kind of purpose we have in our analysis and what kind of data we should use as a consequence. So let me just show you some of my perspective about what some of the limitations could be. And remember, limitations change with the end user and what you're trying to do, I believe, with this data. So for example, one challenge with the SRTM dataset is that we can use it to study the bathymetry of a reservoir that was built after the year 2000. If we go before that, then we have some challenges that need to be addressed. Landsat is great. We can go back to ideally 1972. In reality, there are some challenges there. We can study any reservoir, any dam, but it suffers from cloud cover. MODIS is a bit coarse, perhaps, 250-meter resolution. Sentinel, well, is the period short or not? I think it depends on what you're trying to do, of course. For JSON, for example, may not be available for our location. So again, it may not be a challenge. So what are the challenges for hydrologists? So what would be on my wish list as I set up a hydrological model? Well, ideally, the data I'm working with should be available for a very long period of time, as long as possible. If you offer me 40 years of data, of good data, I will certainly work with those. But the point is, we want to calibrate models, we want to validate models. So being able to work with, let's say, at least a couple of decades or so certainly helps. In principle, we would like to have data about dams everywhere, because by doing so, we can represent, in fact, all dams within the models. And ideally, we wouldn't really like to work with images or data more broadly that are affected by cloud cover. So altimetry is much better in that regard. In the work we've been doing, we ended up working with the SRTM dataset and Landsat. So our choice as modelers were, okay, we're going to work with something that is available everywhere and for a longer period of time, but we're conscious of the fact that it's affected by cloud cover, so we need to correct for that. There's a price to pay, unfortunately. There's always a trade-off when you try to work with different data. So how do we do this? We essentially have 3 steps, which are, I believe, quite intuitive. And I'm going to simplify what these steps are. Number 1, we work with a digital elevation model to create the hypsometric curves. The hypsometric curves are essentially telling us how the area relates to storage, how the elevation relates to area, and so on. So we essentially study the bathymetry of each reservoir. Second, we take Landsat images. We correct. WSA stands for water surface area. So we correct for the presence of cloud cover to estimate what the water surface area is. And once we have information on water surface area and the area storage curve, we can infer what the storage is. That's the third step. The fourth step is if we have data from satellite altimetry, for example, from SAR, then we can try to, we do in fact, validate our results. It's not a direct validation in the sense that we don't have ground observations, but if the estimations we get are similar while coming from 2 different satellite products, then we can, at least to some extent, I believe, build some confidence in our estimate. So the examples I'm going to give you is from the Upper Mekong. I believe I can go quite quickly here. Probably most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the study site. I will actually show you this image instead. So what we see here is the cascade of 11 dams, which is also monitored by the Stimson Center. 10 large dams, let's say 10 dams larger than 100 million cubic meters, plus Lidi, which is a little bit smaller than that, total capacity in the order of 42 cubic kilometers. Most of them, this made the development of our algorithm, I would say, a little bit easier, is the fact that all but from Man1 were built after the year 2000. So it's easier to build the bathymetry, to study the bathymetry of this data. So talking about the bathymetry, how do we estimate the area storage curve? As I mentioned, we use a digital elevation model. So the idea is that this is an example for Nusadu. We can study how the relationship between area and storage changes by taking small, for example, 1 meter vertical increments of elevation. And validating these, we can use, for example, information about the design features of the dam. So if we know what the maximum surface area is and the maximum full storage, then ideally our hypsometric curve should cross exactly through this point. This is another example for Xiaowan. Nusadu and Xiaowan, as you probably know, are the 2 largest dams within the system. Working with estimating water surface area is a bit more challenging because we need to correct for cloud cover. I'm not going through the details of how we do that during the presentation, but if you have any questions, of course, I'm more than happy to answer that. So what you see here on the bottom is an example for Nusa Dua, starting from 2008 to the end of 2020. The lighter dots, each dot corresponds to roughly to one observation. The temporal resolution is roughly in the order of a couple of weeks. That's the observation periods for Landsat images. As you can see, they're not particularly accurate. Reason being is that many of those are affected by cloud cover, particularly during the monsoon season. So we can use a cloud cover, a cloud correction algorithm, which gives us the other points, and then you can see here that the story in a way starts to unfold. We can see the period before which the dam was built. You can see the filling period of the dam, and then you can see the typical cycles that you can observe in dams in Southeast Asia, which is due to the monsoon. The darker dots is our validation, which essentially carried out by using JSON observations. So altimetry, there's a little bit of discrepancy, to be fair. I believe that is something we have to accept or live with if we use different products. But overall, I think we can fairly conclude that the major trends are captured. The same is for CL1. So once we have this information about the bathymetry and we have information about the water surface area, we can put the information together to estimate storage. So what you see in this plot over here is a history essentially from 2008 to 2020 of how storage changed in the upper Mekong reservoir system. So the blue dark line shows us the total system storage. We can see a number of quick increases that corresponds essentially to the filling of the largest dams, particularly CL1 and Nusa Dua. These boxes that you see here tell us what the minimum maximum storage could be by design. So you can also see that as we reached more recent times when the system was more or less fully developed, the storage never reached the maximum storage nor the minimum storage. It somehow fluctuates. In the middle, the vertical lines correspond to the moment in which the different dams came online. So you can probably appreciate the fact that in, let's say, 12, 13 years, we moved from probably 2 to 3 cubic kilometers to more than 30 or so, depending on the specific season. The yellow and green line are the two largest dams, again, Nusa Dua and CL1. So some of the ongoing work that we have at the moment, wrapping up this first part, we're extending these to all dams in Southeast Asia. This moment, we first want to complete the work in the Mekong, so going south, essentially. After that, we will be moving to the other dams within the region. We're pushing it to 2022. But most important, we want to go as far as possible as back in time, starting from 1984 when Landsat 5 came online. Our goal is not really to compete with Brian or the Stimson. Our goal is to create data that can be used for hydrological modeling. So we come really from a hydrological modeling perspective. So we want to work with Stimson, not really to compete with. We're trying to improve a little bit. As I mentioned, the water surface area estimation is always a bit challenging because of cloud cover. There are more data available nowadays, for example, using Sentinel. So we're trying to use that information to improve the algorithm a little. We have an open tool, an open source toolbox coded in Python to estimate water surface area. It's already online. We keep working on it. So it's the development is ongoing. But if you're curious, if you want to give it a go, please feel free to do so. So now that we have these storage time series, how do we use them? So let me go a little bit faster in the second part of the presentation. Well, there are many different hydrological models out there. The specific hydrological model that we use is called VIC. VIC stands for Variable Infiltration Capacity. If some of you work rather frequently in the hydrological modeling domain, perhaps you've heard about VIC. It's spatially distributed. It means essentially that if you look at here on the right-hand side, you can essentially model each cell within a catchment, and within each cell, we essentially solve the hydrological balance, the water and the energy balance. So for a given hydrometeorological data set containing precipitation, rainfall, temperature, humidity, and so on, we can calculate what amount of water that infiltrates, what amount of water that is retained by the soil, and what amount of water that eventually makes its way through the river. The second part is the routing. That is, we take the overland runoff and we take the base flow and we route this through the river network. The fundamental part here is that we modified these specific elements because the water doesn't flow anymore freely through the river network. It's controlled by dams. So for each dam, each major dam within the basin, what we do, we essentially solve the mass balance and therefore calculate what amount of water is retained by the dams, what amount of water that flows downstream. And as a bonus, you can get, of course, the hydropower production. The example I'm going to show you is from 2005 to 2020. We closed the outlet of the model at Changshan. And then you have the question, okay, how do we model reservoirs? So the example that you see, what you see here on the left and right hand side are Siawan on the right hand side, Nusa Dua on the left hand side. You can see from January to December what the typical storage is. Of course, it changes from year to year, but it also does follow a seasonal pattern. So emptying during the pre-monsoon season, reaching the lowest value around May to June, and then filling in again during the wet season. So the idea is there are many different ways. Again, I'm not going too much into the details, but there are different ways in which we can take this information and put it within a hydrological model. In the specific example I'm going to show you, we use this as a rule curve. So we know what the target storage is during each month or each day, if you interpolate, and operate the reservoir as a consequence. There are other ways of doing that, of course. Now, this plot is a little bit busy, so let's perhaps just focus on the top. What you see on the top is the river discharge at a virtual station where essentially storage was inferred using satellite images. The blue line is the inferred or observed storage, and the envelope of variability of the model, because there's for some uncertainty in your hydrological simulation, is the one represented by the dark green line. So I would say there are a couple of things to observe. The most important thing is that, as you can see, the minimum flow keeps increasing every year. And that's not surprise. That's due to the fact that dams are storing water, releasing more during the dry season and keeping more during the wet season because they're filling in. So the fact that the model is able to capture this non-stationarity, this trend is good news. And I'm not trying to sell you the model, I'm really like critically looking at what the model is able or not able to do, of course. The second point is that, of course, the model is able to follow the cycle that we have throughout the year, so dry and wet season. Similar observations, I think, can be drawn for the observed river discharge at Changshan. And again, I think I'm running a little bit out of time here, so I'll go back to these later. If any of you have questions, I'd be happy to answer. But let me show you just one example application. I mentioned at the very beginning, we can answer what-if questions. So the most perhaps basic question you can answer is, okay, how would the system behave under the same meteorological forcings without dams? That's the very first thing you can try to do, I think. So what we did, we ran the model. This is the output at Changshan, river discharge in cubic meters per second, with dams, brown line, and without dam, blue line. So you can see that starting from 2012, 2013 or so, when the largest dams came online, the things started to behave very differently. So if you look at this specific period here, you can see that during natural conditions, the dry season is much drier. This is something that has been pointed out many times, not only for the upper Mekong, but for the lower Mekong as well. Dams do have an impact. They store water, they release more water during the dry season. So the dry season flow is much, much higher, more than twice. And the wet season flow, sorry, as a consequence, decreases. Of course, there are many more questions. You could run optimization. You can change the operating rules. There are many other things you can try to do, of course. But let me wrap things up. I told you briefly about a software for inferring storage time series, pros and cons. Of course, there's no silver bullet. I think when we're studying dams, depends on what we're trying to do. There are always some costs, I think, that we will incur depending on what our goal is. We're in the process for the Upper Mekong. This is done of implementing these in Vic and Vickers. The model is online. I would say it's not super user friendly. This is research software, so there's not a nice graphical user interface. But if you want to try, we will be more than happy to help you should you have any questions. And we aim at finishing the work for the Mekong in terms of entire Mekong in terms of storage and hydrological model by spring, early summer, and later on we will be focusing on the remaining basins in Southeast Asia. So thank you for your attention. Let me also acknowledge the Singapore Ministry of Education has been generously funding this research for a few years, and now Cornell University. So thank you again.
Thank you, Stefano. Wow, what a great way to set up our conversation and to demonstrate your results. And I wish that I had an opportunity to overlay your results with our operations curves for Xiaowen and Nuojiadu, the largest dams in the system, which are significantly larger than any other dams in the system. And compared to yours, there will be many similarities and there's much overlap. And as you were showing your data, I was, it's just comforting to see the confirmation and the affirmation that different inputs can produce very similar results. Yet there are differences, and perhaps another topic for another webinar is to look at the differences and why those differences are happening. I have two questions for you, and then we'll go to our discussants. One is about what kind of promise do you think that this type of work can bring? What opportunities are there for outside of academia for application and for the use of this data in practice? How do you envision it being put to use?
Okay, so thanks for the question. I think the fundamental challenge that we still face in region like the Mekong is, and which is why I was so fascinated by the work that you guys started, is the fact that there's often a lot of conversation on the fact that rivers are not free flowing, that dams are altering the hydrological processes. Often, perhaps sometimes different countries pinpoint to each other with the fault is, but we lack the fundamental information. That is, we don't even know how much water is being stored. So I think confirming different studies, right, being able to show that using different type of information, we tend to get the same conclusions in terms of how much water is being stored is fundamental. And that I think having information, having knowledge is the first step that we need in order to have a fair discourse among many different stakeholders and among many different countries. So that's the first step. And for that, I think we need very accurate observations of what is happening right now, but also we need to be able to go back in time. Sometimes filling a dam can be done in a very aggressive way, or we can do it in 10 years. And that can have consequences. And again, having that information, I believe, helps. It also will help in the future because then we can better prepare. The second thing, and that perhaps is a more comprehensive answer to your question, is the fact that being able to take this information that we can have about river discharge or about dams and being able to integrate it in models that are open source can further boost that conversation. I have to say, models are never perfect, quite the opposite instead. But the fact that they're open source, the fact that different people can use them, find a bug, fix it, the models are on GitHub, so anybody can go use, correct, etc. I think builds a little bit of trust rather than having black boxes. And once we have models, we can ask a number of what if questions and anybody can go try and verify. So for example, what if there's a new dam and we assume that that dam will be filled using a strategy that is similar to the one that has been adopted in the past? How will the river discharge change for the next couple of years? How should people adapt? So that's the kind of use that I hope to see in the tools that I develop with my team, but more broadly that are being developed for the region.
Well, thank you for that. I think that this is potentially useful for countries like Cambodia, which remain somewhat of a frontier for building hydropower and other reservoirs in the Mekong. China's built its largest dams. We kind of know what the definite future looks like for China. There will be more dams built, and those dams will have somewhat of an impact, but they're not going to be huge like Shaowan and Nojadu. Laos already has over 100 either under construction or completed. There is possibility for Laos to have more large dams within its territory. So that could be your model could be applied there. But Cambodia is looking to maintain its moratorium on mainstream dams, but also look at some of the tributaries of the Mekong, like the Srei Pok and the Say San, and to at the same time protect the Mekong flood pulse and the Tonle Sap River and the Tonle Sap Lake expansion and all the bounty that comes from that. So I think particularly for Cambodia, your approaches could be very useful as they explore new dams. One other question is in our latest annual report, and I'm going to have Courtney drop a link to that report in the chat, as well as Courtney, please drop a link to Stefano's newest report as well for everyone to download. We're able to pinpoint monthly and actually weekly impacts, but we publish monthly impacts of dams along the course of the river, groupings of dams, of the 55 dams that we monitor, and 5 different gauges now from Changsan all the way down to Stung Treng. And, we're able to come up with information like during certain months at Changsan, China's upstream dams can triple river flow during the dry season. During certain months, all the way downstream at Stung Treng, dam restrictions combined of all those 55 dams can reduce flow by like 17% in a certain month, which is a very large reduction of flow, a significant reduction of flow, particularly if that's in a time of need. But it's hard for us to go lower than monthly with confidence. Weekly is definitely possible. We need to work on that. But what you're doing is daily. It seems, and daily modeling and daily simulation. And that's what's really needed for planning and modeling and simulation. So I do want to just, heap some praise on you for being able to get to that daily holy grail, if you will, of understanding the dam impacts. The question, though, is that remote sensing is somewhat new to the region. And what we find when we try to disseminate our information for use cases for planning and modeling is that governments in the Mekong say, well, this is useful, it's informative, we understand it, but it's remotely sensed. It's from satellite imagery. It's not from physical gauges or actual monitoring. How much time do you think it will take to change the way that that governments use remote sensing for decision making? What are some examples you can draw on from, say, the West for application of remote sensing for these purposes, if there are any, and some insight that might be useful to the region for uptake of remote sensing and satellite derived imagery?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, this is a wonderful question. So typically, there's a very long history of remote sensing for hydrology, particularly in the West and particularly in North America. I believe in general, governments do not rely too much on remote sensing when it comes to operational decision making of hydraulic infrastructure. As far as I know, or as far as I believe. But the flip side of that is that the information we can retrieve nowadays, given three things. A, the amount of data that we have that we can get from different missions. B, how long that has been done for. And C, all the algorithms that now are available as data analysis tools that can somehow clean for cloud images, for cloud cover, pardon me, or other problems. I think that allows us to be extremely accurate. So one perhaps way of proving that is simply to take existing reservoirs for which we have there are public domain data and showing that remote sensing can track their storage perfectly. So one example from Southeast Asia that comes to my mind is Thailand. So for example, storage data for example, Bhumibol and Sirikit dams are of public domain. Anybody can download them from if I'm not wrong, is the Thai irrigation department. But anyway, it's easy to find this data and download the time series and test algorithms. And we've done that already to some extent. And I think if you take the project you guys are using and apply to those reservoirs, it will work just perfectly. So I think one way of convincing, historically, government agencies and government more broadly adopted hydrological models when they started to believe and see something concrete. For example, showing that you can capture to a fair extent the hydrograph as it evolves over time. And I think showing that we're able to capture the ground truth is perhaps one direction that we can take.
Great. Indeed, yeah. Ground truthing, validating, comparing to actual operations curves is a way to demonstrate the veracity, right? The accuracy of
but also, excuse me if I interrupt you, just even if we don't have sometimes, most of the time we don't have ground truth, but imagine that two different satellites launched by two different countries ultimately lead you to the same result. It's not a ground truth observation, but it's, I think, quite powerful implicit or indirect validation of what we can do.
Indeed. Well said. All right, well, let's move to our discussants. I've probably taken up too much time with my questions and conversation. We're going to go to Sotira first for a reaction and some questions to Stefano, and then to Dr. Ajahn Piatida. Sotira, to you.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, can hear you well.
Yes. So thank you so much, Brian, and also thank you so much, Dr. Stefano, for the presentation. This is very helpful for me to see this type of project exists in Southeast Asia, especially the Mekong River, because the data is really important for us. And I work with fish bio to monitoring the migratory fish, which is the dam is really the big challenge for the fish to migrate from one country to another country. So seeing this type of data really like a good tool for the future to talk with the governments and also with the investor that focus on the hydropower dams. So I do have some question because it is for me I feel like this is also a little bit technical, but I think I do have question related to the bathymetry and topography. There's a lot of active sand mining and also sediment change, because when we go to talk with the local peoples, they always bring up the change. Like sometimes the water get deeper, sometimes it gets shallower based on some part. So I think from what I heard, I feel like the bathymetry is changing. So how does it also affect the modeling process? Thank you.
Well, you said it was technical, but I think you got one of the most technical aspects right. So that's a wonderful question, and in full honesty, I think that is something that we need to improve. We in my group, but I think across the board and other groups that work on this topic. I would say the main challenge is that there are already good sediment transport model for Southeast Asia, including the Mekong, but what we are lack are good observations of different types of sediments and how they are transported through the river network. Without that, it's going to be challenging to update the bathymetric curves that we have. So I think there's no doubt that these bathymetric curves over decades will change. So I think if you're studying a relatively short period, 4, 5, perhaps even 10 years, for dams with a very large volume, we can perhaps assume that these curves are, let's say, constant over time. In fact, they do evolve slightly as a function of sediment transport. We are starting, I believe, to scratch the surface of that problem. And going all the way back to data, what I think we need are better data for sediment transport so that we can update these curves. So yes, that is a challenge for sure, which I should have mentioned.
Yeah, thank you so much. I
Thank you
think
very
I
much.
have one more question. It's also related to the climate change scenario because you also talk about the catchment data like evaporations, also the rainfalls. So I also want to know like do you also like does it change because of the climate change as well or just because of the dams? So yeah, because I feel like when people talk about the flow, they can also say, oh, because it's getting hot, so uh it the water evaporate more, so the degrees of the water. So I just want to know like does it also affect the flow and in the modeling process?
So yeah, I think in general, every time we try to attribute something to climates, we have be very, 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 very careful. What we did, and this is not to say that climate is not changing. It is. It's just that I think it depends on which kind of questions we're answering. So what I was showing now was a retrospective analysis from 2005 to 2020. So if we're interested in dams only, running a model with and without dams means that we're changing only one factor. So by doing that, we're sure that being the model deterministic, the only driver that can change river discharge can only be the presence of dams. So in general, I think when we're looking at dams, as far as I'm concerned, at least I always like to start by looking at the past period, because then I know that I am eliminating a source of uncertainty that is climate. Going forward, we're going to have two effects then. We're going to have future climates, which will unfold in different ways. We just, of course, don't know which one, and hydraulic infrastructure. The combination of the both will be more challenging to untangle. In general, my sense is the volumes at play here across the entire Mekong, in terms of how much the number of dams that has been built and the volumes to regulate river discharge, I think that will be the leading factor rather than climate, at least for a few more years. But depends on how climate is going to unfold. It's very difficult to tell at the moment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stefano.
Thank you, Sotiero. Let's go to John Piatita for her reaction and some questions, and then we'll turn this over to Courtney Weatherby to round us out with questions from the audience. John Piatita.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you very much, Dr. Stefano. As we understand from your work that the remote sensing data, they contain bias and error, right? And also for the modeling, also we have calibration and validation and uncertainty in the parameters that we use in the model. So, before we dive into the results, I'm speaking from a research perspective. Would it be possible to quantify the uncertainty from different parts, like the input, the meteorological forcing, as well as other input data that we use as input into the model, and then the uncertainty that generate from the model itself? So I think this might provide like the range of uncertainty that we can try to refer from the result from the model. and the remote sensing data.
Yes, I agree with that. So there are different types of uncertainty. Normally in hydrological models, three, I would say in particular, we try to group them. One is the structural uncertainty, the fact that there are processes that we know well, processes that we do not know well, processes that some hydrological models captures, processes that other hydrological models do not capture, depending on why they were built. So that essentially reflects our understanding of physical processes. We have uncertainty in the input. For example, two different meteorological products, rainfall observations, may not necessarily agree fully, and as a consequence, our simulation result might differ slightly. And then we have uncertainty in the parameters, because of course the calibration can yield to slightly different results. So when you combine these three different sources of uncertainty, what you get is what you are correctly referring to as an ensemble of simulations. And I think communicating that, I didn't go too much into it, but communicating that is important, because while assuming that, you know, one deterministic simulation is the solution or is perfect, well, we know that that is not true. So I think communicating, showing ensemble is important. So I absolutely agree with that. And there are, I think, nowadays good techniques to serve that purpose.
So I think if we can try to communicate that information along with the resource and the interpretation would help improve the understanding and how we can utilize the information. And just one more question, like you mentioned, relatively new data set like Sentinel, but with limitation on the long time series. Are you also planning to do data assimilation to try to combine the advantage of each data set into your work?
So in general, I would say that data simulation is something that is used more in an operational setting as we run a model in real time. Our interest is, as I was mentioning, trying to go back in time as much as we can, but that somehow pushes us to rely on Landsat. But it is true that there are all these great products like JSON, Sentinel, etc., or SWOT now that produce much more information for the past 5-10 years. So what we're trying to do now is to use data simulation in a way to get that information and calibrate, validate our algorithms better, so that when we push them back in time, we can rely a bit more on the data that they produce. So we're trying to bank on recent information to improve the estimation back in the past.
Thank you. And I'm also looking forward to if you can use the data to validate the storage in the reservoirs. I think it will be very interesting. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Stefano.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for a great discussion, and thank you to all of our audience members for submitting questions through the Q&A box. We're going to try and get to as many of these as we can. We might go just a few minutes over 10 to try and answer all of them. So most of these, Stefano, are going to be addressed to you, but I certainly welcome Ajahn Piatida and Satira to chime in if they have any thoughts on some of the questions we're going to ask. So I'm going to ask one question first, Stefano, which is just about some of these new technologies and how they might enhance and refine modeling. So we had a question from Art Restrepo asking about how AI and machine learning might be able to enhance and refine this very well-designed model moving forward.
Okay, so two answers. When it comes to estimating storage and water surface from satellite images, a lot of algorithms rely on machine learning. The idea is, for example, you have observations, cloud-free observations. So you can use a machine learning model to then clean images that are affected by cloud cover by banking of observations that are not affected by cloud cover. In fact, that is what we do. I just didn't go into the mathematical details. There's a lot of deep learning and other machine learning being used. For hydrological models, normally the hydrological models are, at least the one we use, are process-based. So they rely on the underlying physical processes. But for example, estimating the uncertainty, that is something that can be done with machine learning.
Thanks. And I think most of the other questions are actually going to kind of dig into how this approach can be used on the ground. So we've got a number of questions from Mai Chan from Radio Free Asia. So Mai asks, do you use satellite data, or do any of your partners use this type of data to research drought and saltwater intrusion in the lower Mekong River? Can you point to ways that the type of data that you're producing could support really sort of on the ground impact focused analysis? And then sort of as a secondary aspect to that, if Vietnam or stakeholders in Vietnam learn and use your research methods, do you think that they can then apply them to monitor the environment in the Delta and develop better policies?
Okay, so the short answer is that in our specific project, we started from the upper reaches of the Mekong, so upper Mekong, and we're slowly moving downstream. We haven't reached the Delta yet. So we haven't done specific monitoring work in the Mekong Delta, to be honest. So we haven't monitored the water intrusion in the area. There are ways, I believe, of doing that, and in principle, we can use satellite images or altimeters not only to monitor water reservoirs. We can also do that to monitor water bodies more broadly, and that applies to deltas as well.
And if I can add here,
yep.
Yeah, the delta is really complex. It's extremely difficult to begin to see the dam impacts. In fact, we have trouble estimating dam impacts below Stung Treng, Cambodia. The discharge data provided by the MRC starts to show tidal impacts from the ocean up through the delta all the way to Kratie in Cambodia. So it's hard for us to take out what's tidal impact and what is actual discharge coming downstream. Of course, you've got the Tonle Sap effect of water going into the Tonle Sap and then coming out, and what is coming out is also original discharge from the upstream. So that muddies the picture. And then, of course, as we get into the delta, there are the strong tidal effects on a daily basis. But then, to Sotirot's point, the bathymetry of the delta's rivers are changing as well. They're actually lowering as a result of sand mining upstream. And that just adds so much more complexity. That would be, the ultimate project, I think, to work on, to be able to determine what the various impacts are to hydrology in the delta, but to zero in and pinpoint the dam impacts is increasingly complex and more difficult.
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely.
Well, and that leads into sort of one additional question, which someone had asked, when we're looking at the amount of data that's out there, there's your modeling, Stefano, there's the Mekong Dam Monitor, there's a huge body of data and work being done by the Mekong River Commission. Is it possible to use this process and software along with these other data sets to potentially create sort of a whole basin riparian model that could be used? To really track on a very large scale what's going on and combine understanding of those over 200 dams around the region, as you were flagging, you're hoping to model throughout the rest of this year.
Yeah, so that's one of the goals that we have in this ongoing project that we have, is to extend the hydrological model that we have to the entire Mekong, which we have done. But the work that we're doing now is to infer stores for each large dam, and then learning how to put that into the hydrological model. It's very meticulous work because each dam needs to be done properly. It takes a little bit of time. We want to make sure that the source MCRs are correct. But that is our end goal. So modeling primarily hindcast. We will be looking from mid-80s, give it or take, to roughly 2020 or 2022, for the reason I was mentioning before. Working with past hydrological observations removes at least one factor of uncertainty. That means we can focus more on dams, essentially. But that is our goal, yes.
All right, thanks. And I think this is probably our last question for the day since we're just reaching the end of time, but I think it's a particularly pertinent one. So we have a question from Darius Sadigi from Princeton University asking, do you currently struggle with data sets or measuring instruments or other inputs being patchy across the various Mekong countries involved because of government structures, differing technical or measuring capacities, or institutional access? And then if yes, what can be done to improve the quality of research and increase data sharing? So he knows that he does research in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam and knows that many of those with whom he collaborates can't afford to access many of the relevant or high quality data sets. So how do we address these data access challenges?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I think the larger amount of data we could work with, and this is true for me or everybody else, better it would be more data on discharge. I think would be great. More data on sediment transport. Sediment transport is a big challenge. Is another would be great to work with. Another important thing I believe would be the cross section of rivers. We don't really have good information of that, and that especially because of sand mining. And also because dams are trapping sediments is changing. So information on the cross-section of rivers would be particularly useful as well. So I think more broadly put, anything we can monitor in the Mekong, more broadly in Southeast Asia in terms of environmental processes would be great to have. Satellites have their own challenges, but I believe that's a different story. Sometimes, for example, data are patchy. There can be sensor failures in Landsat images, so you have these black stripes that you need to clean. But that is something I think we can deal with. We have to accept. But more data in the region would be absolutely great. And if you have data, please share.
Well, thanks. And I'll just throw out again and just sort of a clarifying question for you, Stefano. It looks like almost all of the data inputs that you use are publicly available. Are there any of the data sets that that you had to sort of find a replacement for something where it was paid and you couldn't afford to pay for that? And how did you find ways around that? Or did you find that most of the data you needed was available and just took some digging to find?
It's all open source. So Landsat is available from the NASA website or from Google Earth Engine. So is the digital elevation model. And that's pretty much all that we use in terms of external sources when it comes to inferring storage. Same is for altimeters. So when it comes to remote sensing, I think the work that NASA and Google Earth Engine have been doing is amazing. We just need to go there and learn perhaps how to use the data download features, but then everything we can download is free. A lot of algorithms for cleaning images are available online and they're coded in Python, including ours. That also makes life easy. Hydrological modeling is a bit more challenging. All the data we use are also open source and can be downloaded. The model is also available online. It requires more work because there are a lot of different data that needs to be downloaded and prepared. But I think nowadays we don't have the challenge anymore of not being able to access public domain data when it comes to large scale hydrology. I think pretty much everything we need is there. So the only thing I paid was the river discharge, which I bought from the Mekong River Commission database. Other than that, but it's not too expensive. Other than that, everything was open source.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I think we actually have gotten through all of the questions in the audience. And since we're a couple minutes over time, I think we're going to go ahead and close out today's Mekong Water Data Hour. But thank you, Stefano. Thank you, Piatida. Thank you, Sotrath, all for joining us for this discussion. We hope to see many of you and some of those in the audience as well at future Mekong Water Data Hour discussions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.